So my name is Andreas Umland. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation, which is a small think tank in Kiev. And since 2004, I have been editor of a book series called Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society. It's a new book series with a small German publisher called IBIDEM Verlag or IBIDEM Press in Stuttgart and Hanover. And one of the foci of this book series were so far around 170 volumes have appeared. One of the foci is Ukrainian affairs, Ukrainian politics, and one of the highlights of this particular sort of sub-series within the book series was a long study of the Orange Revolution, consisting of 6 collected volumes of essays, of papers on different aspects of the Orange Revolution, the comparative aspects, the prehistory of the Orange Revolution, the history of the Orange Revolution itself, historical documents, and so on. And so I guess that is the largest study of the Orange Revolution. Partly these were reprints just of papers from the various journals, but partly these were original papers as well. But there were also, since then, this was in the mid-2000s, several other books on Ukrainian current affairs, collected volumes, monographs, and this is one of the foci. The other focus of the book series is my own major research topic, Russian nationalism, different aspects of Russian nationalism, especially Russian ultranationalism. For instance, we translated a seminal study of Russian ultranationalism in the post-war period during the Soviet Union by Nikolai Mitrokhin. In the Russian original, it's called Russkaya Partia, or in German, it was then republished in my book series in German, Die Russische Partei. But there are also many other books on Russian nationalism in my book series. And now, oddly, in the last years, both of these topics, Ukrainian politics and Russian nationalism, imperial nationalism, have become quite closely interlinked. And also what I could add is that for a couple of years now, the book series is also distributed by Columbia University Press outside Europe, and the books, the English language books, are listed in the catalog of Columbia University Press, which gives the book series a much larger readership. And I would like to invite possible authors who may be looking this video to submit their manuscripts of monographs or collected volumes to this book series in English or in German. Well, I guess now there is already a lot of research. It's also not the only larger study. There was, for instance, a major study by Andrew Wilson on the Orange Revolution, but also by others. And I think it's the general message of this 6-volume study, and that's also why I've taken the trouble to collect it. Was quite a lot of work to get all these essays together and to get it all out in six volumes, is that it was really a turning point in modern Ukrainian history. And I think it was actually the watershed that Ukraine sort of, when Ukraine broke away from the typical post-Soviet path of I would say, the founding republics of the Soviet Union that excludes the Baltic republics, and that set then Ukraine on the path also towards the Euromaidan, towards the association agreement with the European Union, towards the Eastern Partnership Program, towards the visa-free regime. I think the origins for all of that basically was the main starting point, as I would see it, was the Orange Revolution, although it was, of course, a continuation also of other protest movements before, of the Granite Revolution of 1990, the Ukraine against Kuchma movement, and so on. So it was not the only important thing that happened in post-Soviet Ukrainian history until 2004, but it was certainly a major event. I would say it was perhaps historically even in some ways more important than the Euromaidan. The Euromaidan is, of course, the more dramatic event, and it looks on the surface as more important. But I think in terms of really directing Ukraine's modern history, the Orange Revolution was actually the main watershed, and the Euromaidan was in a way only the continuation of the Orange Revolution. I mean, there is even an odd continuity between some of the activists of the revolution on the granite of 1990 and the Orange Revolution, and some of the methods that the revolution on the granite of 1990 already used. And then, of course, there's a lot of continuity in the kind of organization and the way that the insurrection happened in 2013. Then, which is basically the playbook from the Orange Revolution, and the structures, the experience, the people were already there. It just needed a trigger to activate all of this. That there were also new people, of course. There was a younger generation that was also involved, that was too young to have taken actively part in the Orange Revolution. But most of the older activists, they had already played a prominent role in the Orange Revolution. So yes, there's a clear continuity between all three of these revolutions, I would say, of 1990, 2004, and 2013-14. As I said, the watershed was 2004. Because until then, one could see a certain parallelity in the decline of these early democratizations that was very typical of the post-Soviet space. Kuchma was in a way, and Yanukovych then later on, they were in a way trying to do similar things as Putin was trying to do, and all the other regressions that we saw before from Belarus to Central Asia. And it seemed until 2004 that Ukraine was on a similar path. And that continuity was then broken, and there was a pluralistic period, a chaotic also period from 2004 till 2010. But that was also the period which made then the attempted regress by Yanukovych impossible, and that was the big misunderstanding. One can only be sort of surprised how much Yanukovych and his circle misunderstood Ukraine, and they thought that they could get away with all of this and be sort of little Putins in Ukraine, and that I think one of the reasons that wasn't possible is that Ukraine had by then already the experience of the post-Orange period, of the Orange Revolution itself, and the sort of just the experience of a political system that is not monolithic like in Russia, and in that way, I think it was a truly historical event. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem was that the civil society didn't continue on immediately after the Orange Revolution, that they sort of demobilized, and that they left basically the field to the politicians, and who then got into this quarrel between Yushchenko and Tymoshenko and so on, and that was the problem in a way. And but then I think the civil society, there's a lot of there's some discontinuity obviously between 2004 and 2013, but there's a lot of continuity as well, and as I said, this historical experience was just invaluable. Then the Euromaidan turned out to be, of course, a much more violent and bloody conflict than the Orange Revolution was. But certainly the sort of the organizational experience was all there. The structures were there. The people knew each other from 2004, and basically that was just a replay of the things that people had learned already in 2004, and one could even argue partly in 1990 during the revolution on granite. And then I think the lesson today has been taken from after the Orange Revolution, that after the Euromaidan, the civil society did not demobilize. I think that is one of the big differences in the aftermath, that people basically got a historical lesson, the civil society activists, that you cannot leave this to the politicians. You have to continue pressuring. You have to finish the job, and this fight is still going on now. And two other things that changed, I think, after the Euromaidan, if I may say, is that the international organizations also learned their lessons. So the Western actors are now much more active after the Euromaidan than after the Orange Revolution. And also, I think the Ukrainian diaspora has been more sustained in its engagement in Ukraine after the Euromaidan. And that was unfortunately less so the case after the Orange Revolution. I think the big surprise of the time was that something like that was possible in a former Soviet founding republic of the USSR, and in one that has gone through high Stalinism. So in a way, one could argue that in those territories where high Stalinism, and by that I mean the 1930s, which had not experienced that, like the Baltic republics, they had a far better chance to democratize, whereas the flattening of civil society and national traditions during the 1930s was, of course, much stronger under Stalinism than later on. So, in a way, that was, I think, the event itself was the big surprise. Also, the peacefulness of the insurrection, and maybe there was also a bit of too much enthusiasm in that people thought that because it was such a surprising and great event and peaceful event, things would work out afterwards by themselves. But unfortunately, I would put a lot of the blame on the personality of Viktor Yushchenko, but also on other factors. The hopes were not fulfilled, and then Yushchenko, even in a strange way, helped Yanukovych to come to power during the two rounds of the 2010 presidential elections, when he declined to support unambiguously Tymoshenko and even undermined her election campaign to some degree. Yes, I wouldn't exclude that there might be yet another revolution in store if things do not get well. But, on the other hand, I mean, the Granite Revolution, the Orange Revolution were largely peaceful. The Euromaidan only turned really violent in its last month, and so maybe if things do not get better, and if we basically have a restoration here and just a change of clans, the Donetsk clan is exchanged for the Vinnytsia clan, then indeed, I mean, there might be something like that. But I think that is now, I would say, less likely than before, because I think everybody knows this scenario, and also the people currently in power, they know that this cannot be excluded, and that they could end up in exile like Yanukovych at the end of the day. So my hope is that after all, the development here will be evolutionary and not revolutionary. For instance, one of the volumes is purely comparative. It basically sets the Orange Revolution in the context of other color revolutions. One of them is basically on the period before the Orange Revolution and sort of the events leading to that. Another one is largely filled with documents, for instance, election observation reports on the 3 rounds of the elections. So it depends on what you're interested in, but it's sort of. But I think it's good for teaching, especially because you have everything collected, and if you want to cover it, you can just assign it, and all the major authors are represented. I don't think it's the last word, obviously, on the Orange Revolution, but it covers, because each of them is a collected volume, with several authors in there. It covers a large range of it. But there are also, of course, other books now, and in a way, I mean, there are now also the more interesting books will be now about the Euromaidan, because unlike with the Orange Revolution, I think the interpretation of the Euromaidan is and what happened afterwards, and what was the international factor and the factor of national identity. I think it's much more it's much more diverse, these interpretations, and there's much more conflict in the interpretation of the Euromaidan and its aftermath than the Orange Revolution, where there are no such major debates anymore. So I think I'm also now going to publish more as many as I can books on Euromaidan Ukraine and post Euromaidan Ukraine. Because here, I think the war of ideas is still going on, and the war of concepts, interpretations, and theories. There are basically two types of text published. There are secondary analysis, empirical analysis of the events by scholars, which some of them use quantitative methods, most of them use qualitative methods. And these are basically academic papers, and then there are some sort of primary sources, and these are either official election reports from various official electoral observation missions, some even sort of more pro-Russian, or sort of, I would say, with manipulative election reports. And there are also some individual electoral observation reports from people who went to the regions and who wrote their electoral observation reports. Often they wrote them first for the international organizations for whom they worked, and then they sort of revised these reports for the collected volume. But this is also very valuable because you have some sort of first-hand impressions. There are also photographs and pictures and so on. And so, I think it covers a wide range of. You can also get some impressionistic accounts about the Orange Revolution, not just dry analytical investigations. The main thing was the quality of these papers. There was nothing that sort of and whether there was was a way to get an English version of the paper. Some were translated. So that was the main criterion. And then these, as I said, these impressionistic accounts, they were also quite important, not have only dry analysis. Yeah. So, but as I said, it's now a little bit dated already. These are all. There's now new research as well, and now there will be, of course, a re-evaluation also of the Orange Revolution against the background of the Euromaidan. There will be there are already comparative papers coming out that compare the Orange Revolution with the Euromaidan, and so I think we are now already in a new cycle of analysis of the Orange Revolution. There's also the Arab Spring. There are other events around the world. I created it in 2004 because I had the impression that especially those topics I was then mostly interested in, Russian nationalism or Russian higher education, which I thought were under or and especially actually I started it when I was still a Russianist. I became sort of, or mainly a Russianist. I became a researcher, I would say, of Ukraine only somewhat later. And so it was for me also a tool just to publish things that were sort of below the radar screen. I just had the impression that, there was too much research that was important and that was sort of not getting into the main presses. And so the first volume that was my own was a collection of papers on the implementation of the European Convention on Human Rights in Russia. That was then still an important topic. And now I think I feel in a way justified in that, that what we've seen during the last 20 years was just I would say, a decline of East European studies, especially of political science on Eastern Europe, and because people have just switched after the breakup of the Soviet Union their attention, or the funding organizations, the ministries, the research organizations, they switched their attention to other regions of the world, and sort of post-Soviet studies was not particularly fashionable, and there were other, China and the Middle East and Latin America and so on. And now it turns out that the Eastern Europe and Russia and Ukraine, they are actually quite important for world politics. And now this, I think, the series fits very well into this new cycle of interest in Ukraine and Russia. And so there's now also more and more submissions to the book series. I don't read all the manuscripts myself. I just send them out for peer review. Obviously, I cannot read all that, and I cannot judge all that. And now I'm getting basically submissions already without much advertising it. So there's now obviously a new drive for research on these topics. I moved already to Kiev in 2002. So when I founded the book series in 2004. I was on a lectureship at Oxford in 2004, and unfortunately, actually, I missed the entire Orange Revolution. I wasn't in Kiev because I was teaching in Oxford at this year. Was a rather it would have been better either the year before or the year after. But so I missed myself unfortunately the Orange Revolution. So I was already a little bit interested. I had become interested, and then of course with the Orange Revolution I became very interested in Ukraine, and my moving to Ukraine in 2002 changed obviously my view on Eastern Europe. Above all, my knowledge about Ukraine, but I think I may have had to do less of a move than others, because my previous interest as a Russianist was the Russian radical right, Russian ultranationalism, imperial nationalism. I had written my first dissertation history dissertation on Zhirinovsky, the emergence of his party, and then I was writing in the early 2000s a second dissertation in political science on Alexander Dugin and his movement. And so in a way, I mean, what later on happened was, I would say, less of a surprise to me than maybe to others, because I had studied these sort of ideologies before. So and then it suddenly, what happened was then that my interest in Ukrainian affairs then suddenly coincided with my interest in Russian imperial nationalism, because Ukraine became the main object of Russian imperial nationalism. And so that was then sort of, I could then sort of draw suddenly from my local knowledge here in Kiev, and then from my research on the Russian extreme right to interpret that. But as I said, I've learned a lot. I mean, the Ukraine to me was really a discovery when I came here in 2002. I was in Ukraine before, but when living here in Kiev, it really changed my view on the whole post-Soviet region. Yeah, I think it's a seminal book. It's there were other books by Alexander Yanov, John Dunlop on Russian ultranationalism during the post-war Soviet period, but what Mitrokhin added to this earlier research was a lot of primary material, and he has conducted interviews with many of the activists of this sort of network that existed and that reached from the central committee of the CPSU to the dissident scene, and there were certain communicators that linked then the party functionaries with nationalist dissidents, and it's a gripping story. That's why I also initiated the translation of the book into German. I think it has not yet been translated into English. It would certainly be worth translating into English. As far as I know, it only exists in Russian and in German. And Mitrokhin is now also one of the most original, I would say, researchers of the Donbas War. because he's now writing lots of very good articles, very important articles. They are getting translated in Germany. They've shaped basically the German sort of analytical community's view of the Donbass war, and he has emphasized from the very beginning the crucial role that the Russian state, that the Russian ultranationalists, Russian right-wing extremists have played in escalating the conflict in the Donbass and in creating this sort of pseudo-civil war there. And I think his research also on the post-Soviet period is really seminal on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and he does that he's now a German citizen, as a Russian. He's from Moscow. He's a Muscovite, and he's clearly, you could say, on Ukraine's side in this whole thing, like many other Russian intellectuals who have become sort of Ukrainian patriots in a way, although they remain Russian nationals. So he's very. I can only recommend reading him. Most of his stuff is extremely interesting. Nikolai Mitrokhin. He is I think he's related to Sergei Mitrokhin, to the political activist in Moscow of Yabloko, but I think they are cousins, something like that. I know both of them well, and I would say I'm Nikolai's friend, and he's now writing a book on the Donbass war, and I think it's going to be really a major event, the publication of this book. Unfortunately, even among the sort of democratic opposition to Putin, there are a considerable part of this opposition. For them, still the old saying of, I think, Vinnichenko goes that Russian liberalism ends where Ukrainian independence begins. So this is still a pathology, I would say, also of a part of Russian liberalism. But this is not all Russian liberalism, and there's now I would say now the larger part of the Russian opposition, which is not a big political force, unfortunately, is now sort of fully respective of Ukrainian independence, and it has the return of Crimea in its program. People like Kasparov, they fully accept this, the Ukrainian territorial integrity, and there are many now. I think I would say more and more, even Russian nationalists who become sort of who understand that Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity and political sovereignty has to be respected. There are also some dubious allies that Ukraine has here, some Russian neo-Nazis. Some of them are linked to the Azov regiment that are then on Ukraine's side. But most of the Russians who have now become sort of Ukrainian patriots in a way, they are liberals, of course, and they see. I see it also partly this way. They see Ukraine in a way as a model for Russia, and they look carefully on Ukraine not just because of sympathy, but they look also for guidance how a future Russia should look. And I would even I think I'm going to write an article on this issue, how basically the current model of Ukraine's transformation, the association agreement, the visa liberalization regime, these are all models that at another point in history can then be applied to Russia, and not just the format of these integration and democratization schemes, but also their implementation in Ukraine. For instance, decentralization, liberalization, decommunization. These are things that are happening in Ukraine, and much of it, not all of it is ideal, of course, can maybe someday be also applied in Russia. There's now here also a House of Free Russia in a sort of a cultural center of Russian emigres in Kiev. There are prominent journalists like Yevgeny Kisilyov and Savek Schuster who are active, and there are lots of Russians who come here and who are interested. I'm not sure they always understand all the technicalities of the transition, and because it's also a complicated process. It's also this association agreement, for instance, is is very complicated by itself. The decentralization is a big topic by itself. Decommunization. Each of these projects is huge. So yeah, there's a lot of interest. I think a lot of sympathy, and unfortunately, I have to say, some Ukrainians, they are not as welcoming to this Russian interest for Ukraine as I would wish. Sometimes there is perhaps even sometimes justified suspicion that among these Russians who are coming to Ukraine may be secret agents. That's I guess what the FSB or GRU or all these organs are probably doing, that they are infiltrating these opposition. Russian opposition scenes, but still, I mean, the majority clearly are, and you can see that in their biographies, they are in conflict with Putin, and they should be welcomed in Ukraine, and they should be seen as allies. I think they are, at the end of the day, they might be more important allies in Ukraine's fight for independence than the West, because for them it's an absolutely crucial topic. I mean, for them. It's an existential issue. The Putin fighting the Putin regime is an existential issue for the Ukrainians, and fighting the Putin regime is also an existential issue for the Russian opposition. And in the West, unfortunately, many don't see it that way. For them, Ukraine is a faraway country. It's some inner-Slavic conflict they have, and there's a lot of illusion here in Kiev about the Western support for Ukraine. The people think that Ukraine is going to become soon a NATO member, an EU member. It's not going to happen soon. I mean, lots of things would have to change that people in the West are going to take this risk, just because for them it's not important. Whereas for the Russian opposition, this whole thing is very important. The Russian-Ukrainian conflict, what will happen to the Putin regime? These are the same questions that many Ukrainians ask themselves. Well, I would leave the historical questions to historians. I'm more of a political scientist or political analyst than a historian, though, and I've now also commented on these memory issues and history policy issues. Not so much because I'm that much interested and I'm not an expert on the historical issues, but because these memory affairs have unfortunately become major historical issues. Political issues, and they have become foreign affairs issues. They have become problems in Ukraine's international relations. So first of all, I would be fully in agreement with Anne Applebaum that, of course, Ukraine needs a particular type of nationalism. I would also say Russia needs a particular type of nationalism. These countries need to create political nations. And when the Ukrainians, for instance, have this slogan, Ukraina ponad usse, Ukraine above everything or above all, that looks superficially like a sort of an adaptation of a rather dubious German slogan, Deutschland über alles, Niemeččina ponad usse. But of course, in Ukraine, this slogan, Ukraina ponad usse, has a totally different meaning, I would say, for most people, maybe not for everybody, than Deutschland über alles, Germany above all, in the German context, because here it is about patriotism and about people's engagement for community and people not leaving Ukraine, not taking the exit option, not becoming emigres, but staying here and trying to build a nation state, not an ethnic nation state, but a political nation state. And in that way, I think, yeah, Ukrainian nationalism is good. But the problem that I see here now is that one particular theme that has been pushed by the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory is not only for the unity of the political nation of the Ukrainians a problem, and that is the memory of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, but has also become a major issue in the European integration of Ukraine in the relations between Ukraine and Poland in particular, but also in general in relations with the West. I know that, for instance, the cult that we have now here in Ukraine around Roman Shukhevich is not only problematic for Poland and for Israel and but also for Germany, because Roman Szuchewicz is, as it may sound, also a part of the dark side of German history, because he was an officer of the Wehrmacht and he was a commander for the Schutzmannschaften, for a unit that was that was even more dubious than the Wehrmacht. And of course, for the Poles, it's important because of the Berlin massacre and so on. So, and these themes are being pushed here by the current staff of the Ukrainian Institute for National Memory, and they've now, as I see it, alienated the Poles. Basically, I think the Polish-Ukrainian relations have been poisoned very deeply. That has started basically already under Yushchenko. I think Yushchenko has started basically with creating the National Memory Institute, with putting a nationalist, Yuchnovsky, as the first head of the Memory Institute, with declaring Szuchewicz a national hero. And since then, it has become worse and worse, and that is a strategic issue for Ukraine. This is not anymore about memory. This is about Ukraine is in a fight for survival, and it needs friends, it needs allies, and it has been alienating its closest friend, Poland, during the last years, and it's losing allies, it's losing sympathy, and this is simply not a luxury that Ukraine can afford in this difficult situation. And it's a very complicated situation now that Ukraine is in. And that's why I've become interested in. I was less so interested in 2006, 2007, when basically this whole sort of revival, this basically spread of the cult, of the Bandera cult, I would call it, to put it in a very short phrase, from Galicia to the whole of Ukraine. Then it wasn't that it didn't seem to me that important. It was unfortunate and I think misinformed, but it wasn't that important. But in the last years, it has really become an issue that has poisoned much of the international relations of Ukraine. I mean, the issue at the end of the day is what happened actually, and how you can interpret it. And I cannot research. I'm not going here into archives. I'm not reading on it. But I'm reading the secondary literature, and in the secondary literature, there's a clear divide between the peer-reviewed academic scholarly literature on the one side, both the Ukrainian and the Western one, and then this Ukrainian nationalist historical discourse that is happening basically outside academia. This is, for me, the main dividing line. So in a way, I would be very interested if, let's say, somebody like Vetrovich would publish an article in a major Western journal, and then there would be a discussion around it. But my impression is that it will be very difficult for him to publish an article there, because it will not go through peer review, because it's not the colleagues will not assess it as worth publishing, and that's the judgments that I base my own assessment on. And this is not my own judgment. These are just the sort of the assessments by the structure of academia as they are done, and that's what usually should happen. That's how it is in biology or in medicine or in astronomy. That you have these you have dilettante, writers who write on biological issues or on medical issues or on maybe astrology, and then you have academic discourse, and there's a very clear divide here that most of the academics, I would say 90% of those who are experts on this and who publish in academic book series and academic journals and whose papers and manuscripts go through peer review, they have a very critical view of the own and of the current memory policies in Ukraine. Whereas there's a large amount of of amateur historians, and unfortunately, I would put the staff of the current Institute of National Memory into this category as well, who just don't take part in international academia. They live their own little life, and now they've created real problems for Ukraine's foreign relations, for Ukraine's relations to the West, to the EU, and especially to Poland. Well, first about the Snyder speech, which in the Bundestag, I think, which is by itself a historic event because of the place he spoke and because of his international standing and because of the things he said. I think it's going to be really have a lasting effect on German public discourse. I've tried to make this argument before. I had in 2013 an article called Germany's responsibility for Ukraine, and I couldn't publish it. And I was submitting it, was a little piece, and I was sending it to different because I also said, we have to acknowledge that we have a separate responsibility for Ukraine. We cannot just have a sort of a generic responsibility to the former Soviet Union, but we have to look at Ukraine more so maybe than at other territories. And eventually, it was then published in a very marginal anti-racist journal that took it. Deutschlands Verantwortung für die Ukraine was, I think, the title of the. I mean, Snyder, of course, outlined this in much more detail with much more, stamina, and he's a major historian. I was sort of a dilettante commentator on this before. But in general, one has to say, I think the German misunderstanding here has a lot to do with the absence of German-Ukrainian studies as a fully established academic discipline. We have far less academic research and institutions dealing with Ukraine than Canada, for instance, or than the US. This has now a little bit improved since the Euromaidan. There's now also a professorship at the Viadrina University in Frankfurt-Oder, close to Berlin, being created on Ukrainian history. That's going to be the first professorship, I think since World War II, specifically on Ukraine. In Germany, there was another one in Greifswald on Ukrainian language, but not on Ukrainian history. So it's now improving. There's more happening in this field, but there's still, I think, German Ukrainian studies are underdeveloped, even in comparison to Britain. Although Britain is further away from Ukraine, and British people would naturally have less interest in Ukraine than Germans. And it's only slowly now changing, and so I think this disregard for Ukraine has a lot to do with simply the ignorance of Germans of Ukraine. I think that will now change, and the more that changes, I think the more German also solidarity with Ukraine will grow. About Poroshenko's position and the OUN-UPA and so on, my impression is that this is for him much less of an ideological issue than for Yushchenko. I think Yushchenko was really on this trip, and he started basically this whole movement with the creation of the Memory Institute, and then and making Shukhevich and Bandera national heroes, and naming Vetrovich as head of the SBOR archives and so on. So he started it out of, I think, largely ideological reasons. But Poroshenko and Groysman, I think they have they have also a different background. So in a way, it's a little bit paradoxical. I think for them, my suspicion is for them, these memory issues are basically a tool of distraction from other issues, domestic issues. So so as long as people are discussing history, they will not discuss as much maybe corruption and bribery and nepotism and so on. So it's a useful topic to create sort of distract public discourse from the more prevalent, more important things of internal reform. So that is a suspicion that I have, but I cannot prove it. But otherwise, it's unclear to me why Poroshenko, Groysman, and people like them are pushing this divisive discourse, and why they're even sacrificing now the Polish-Ukrainian relationship to this. I mean, there's also one has to add a lot of Polish things going wrong the last years, and now Poland has also its own conflict with the EU, and has a lot of domestic tension, and there's obviously Polish nationalism. But for Poland, one has to say the stakes in all of that are much lower. Poland is fine. Even if they go really crazy, they're not going to be kicked out of NATO or the EU. They've basically made it. Whereas for Ukraine, the stakes in its Western relations during the fight with Russia are really high, and it cannot afford these sort of these little side battles with Poland, with Israel, and alienating Germans and the European Union and so on. So this is all a very unfortunate development that is undermining really the international embeddedness. So, for instance, one could speculate whether Ukraine could have maybe been part of the recent 3 Seas initiative that had this large summit in Warsaw without the memory conflict. Maybe the Poles would have included Ukraine into that. It would have been, maybe not. It is a EU project so far, but the Poles are very interested in Ukraine. They also understand that Ukraine is for them a national interest, a strategic issue. They understand Ukraine very well, but they are now sort of demobilized, I would say. They are frustrated, and they are now also, of course, they have their own pathologies in their political system now. But still, there are the closest friends that Ukraine has, and Ukraine cannot afford to lose these friends. And in fact, then everybody, maybe the Lithuanians, the Estonians, and they obviously they also have a good understanding. But the Poles are interested. The Poles understand the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. The Poles understand Russia. The Poles understand Ukraine. So and nobody has this sort of, and they are an important EU country. They are a large EU country, and they have a lot of influence also in Russia and in Germany. So the Germans are listening to the Poles in many ways. They take the Poles very seriously. So Poland is important, and Ukraine cannot afford to lose Poland because of this ridiculous memory policies. The main issue for Ukraine is national security, and I think this has to be above everything else, and the foreign affairs and the domestic affairs, they have to follow the prerogative that the Ukrainian state has to survive, and one has to think what needs to be done to do that, and to push a domestically divisive historical discourse, and a historical discourse that alienates Ukraine's major allies is just unwise. It's in fact it has a sort of it's a very bizarre actually behavior in this sort of existential fight that Ukraine is now fighting. Thanks a lot. It's a very big honor for me. Велика честь. Дуже дякую. До побачення.